Hello, AP Langenkamp, students who are going to Link Crew. I wanted to walk you through what we're going to be doing in class tomorrow, Tuesday. And we're going to be going over evidence, reasoning, and strategies and talking a little bit about that. And also looking at the work you did Monday in class with Is Google Making Us Stupid? So the first thing that we want to talk about is rhetorical analysis. I've been using that term over and over again. We know that rhetoric is the way that we use words in order to have a purpose and to achieve our purpose. Analysis is when you pull something apart and look at its various components and then put it back together to determine the overall purpose or use of it. So I refer to it as dissection of writing. Like if you think about biology class, back freshman year when you were dissecting, your frogs. This is dissection of writing. You look at all the different components, you figure out why they're being used or what their use is, and then you put it back together to see how does it work with the system as a whole. So in this case, you're looking for the author's purpose, what kind of strategies they use, and how effective. And you want to ask yourself all the time, how is this author manipulating me? So what you need to consider, first, you always have to think about the author's purpose. What does the author want his audience to do, think, believe, feel, act on, change our minds about? What is the overall goal of the piece of writing? Remember that there are the main purposes: to inform, to persuade, to entertain, and to demonstrate. But then we get more specific. If he's persuading us to do about something, what is he persuading us to do, think, believe, or feel? If he's informing us about something, why does he want us to use or know that information? And if he's entertaining us, what is the purpose of that entertainment? Is it to get us to look at the world in a different way? And if he's demonstrating, obviously, what does he want us to be able to do, make, or take part in? We also want to consider the use of evidence. Now, yesterday I had you do an assignment with the Is Google Making Us Stupid to determine the different evidence, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically about that in a second. But there's lots of different types of evidence that authors can use. Then there's reasoning, and these are like the main points that the author makes. What reasons does the author give in helping us believe what she believes? So reasoning. And then finally, author's use of stylistic and persuasive elements. These are things like metaphors and alliteration and comparisons, some contrasts, cause and effect, repetition. Those are those stylistic tone elements that's maybe you might be more used to kind of like finding in pieces because you've been doing a lot of fiction reading over the last, 10 years of your life. And so fiction writing is very different, and that's where you see those stylistic elements. Okay, so ethos, pathos, and logos. We know that logos is logic and reasoning. Ethos is how we have character and we show our credibility and trustworthiness and how we build our ethics, show that we're good arguers. And then there's pathos and the appeals to emotion. So there's different ways that we can appeal to each of those. You see that listed right here. This is a sheet that I'm also giving to the class members tomorrow. So you can kind of see what that is, and you can see what effect it has on the audience and how we talk about it. One thing that I want you to note here on how to talk about it is right here. We don't say the author uses logos. We say the author appeals to logos, and then we explain how he appeals to logos. The author appeals to logos by defining relevant terms and supports his claim with numerous. So the author appeals to logos through the use of statistic and expert testimony. When we talk about ethos, the author builds his ethos. The author doesn't use ethos. The author builds his ethos. So, and then we always say how. The author builds his ethos through the use of scientific diction, or the author develops her ethos by demonstrating to readers that she's sympathetic. And then when we talk about pathos, when referencing 9/11, the author is appealing to pathos, eliciting both sadness and anger from his reader. The author's description of the child with cancer was a very persuasive emotional appeal. You don't have to use the word pathos either. So the author appeals to pathos through the use of emotional word choice. The author appeals to logos through scientific testimony. The author builds his ethos through blah, blah, blah. It's always what's the appeal, not that they use it, but that they build it or that they appeal to it, and then how. So let's talk about the how. That means that this is just, ethos, pathos, logos are just an umbrella. They're categories of appeals. They aren't strategies. The way, the things that they use through the appeals, the scientific evidence, the connotative diction, all of that stuff, those are strategies. So again, the usage is X appeals to pathos through the use of, X builds her ethos by presenting, X appeals to logos when he provides. No more uses ethos, pathos, and logos. I don't want to hear anyone say that or write that because that is incorrect, and you will not score well on an AP exam if you use that terminology. So when we are appealing to pathos, these are some of the tools that we use or authors use. Imagery that clearly makes us feel a certain way about things that we're reading. Tone, connotative diction, that's diction that makes us, has like really hard emotional appeals. There's the repetitive tools of anaphora, anadisplosis, and antistrophe. Analogies are appeals to pathos, hyperbole, anecdotes, there's tons. Metaphor, similes, comparisons, all of that stuff. The way we use words is basically the appeal to pathos. And stories, anecdotal evidence, anecdotes right here, can also be appeals to pathos, not just appeals to logos. Speaking of appeals to logos, this is where all of that evidence comes in that we talked about yesterday, including allusions if it's used to make a point. If allusions are used to make us feel a certain way, then it's an appeal to pathos. But if they're used to convince us of something logically, then they're appeals to logos. So we have historical and anecdotal evidence and scientific evidence and studies and statistics and definitions and if-then statements. You'll notice that anecdotes are listed here again. But also appeals to logos is through the organization of ideas. Like we talked about inductive and deductive reasoning. That's an appeal to logos. So how logically things are put together. So yesterday I had you look at this different type of evidence, and I've added some extra ones. So scientific evidence can also be referred to as statistical evidence. Scientific evidence, if the author is referring to a specific study but doesn't use statistics like 1 in 4 students, blah, 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 then you refer to it as just scientific evidence. But if they use the statistics, 1 in 4 students found that, then you say that it's statistical evidence. Scientific evidence is the umbrella term there, so if you forget statistical evidence, you can always refer to it as scientific evidence. Historical evidence is evidence that is referring to a particular time period, and it can be part of an analogical evidence, which I'll get to in a second. So if you're talking about the history of a movement, the author could be using historical evidence to show us that this is how things have changed through time. Anecdotal evidence. The word anecdote means story. And the story doesn't have to be a personal story from the author. It could be him explaining someone else's story as well. So a lot of times if we take a look at The True American, for example, our author, Jaharidaris, is telling other anecdotes, the story of other people in his writing. And the whole book is anecdotal evidence to prove the point of how we can't necessarily judge people on the basis of whether they're immigrants or not to our country, or new immigrants or old immigrants, if you want to think about it that way. So anecdotal evidence, anytime the author uses a story, whether it's their personal story or someone else's story, to make a point. Analogical evidence is evidence where the author takes two unlike things and compares them, creates an analogy between those two things. I said historical evidence can be a type of analogical evidence if they say, for example, the period that we're going through right now, the early 2000s, is very similar to the Industrial Revolution, except it is the informational revolution. So if we compare the Industrial Revolution and how things changed in our country to the informational revolution happening in the millennia, the new millennia, That is using historical evidence in an analogical way. Okay. Appeal to authority. That's when you say someone who knows something about the topic. It's also referred to as testimonial evidence, but appeal to authority is the one that's used most frequently on AP exams. So this is the one I'd like you to remember. Someone who is an authority on the topic in one way or another, the author references that person to help us believe what we should. Then there are allusions. Literary allusion is a reference to any kind of literature, piece of literature, usually fiction. Biblical allusion, any kind of allusion to religion. That can be used as evidence as well, if you're, using it to kind of prove your point. And then there's cultural and pop cultural allusion. So cultural allusion is about the American society as a whole. So whenever authors talk about, the American society is this or that, you can refer to that as a cultural allusion. Pop cultural allusion is where the authors refer to something that isn't literary, but it is more popular culture, like social media, or it could be even movies, TV shows, things like that. And those can be used as types of evidence as well. Okay, so all of those we discussed yesterday. Finally, ethos is how you build your respectability. Register is the diction level that you're using within a piece. You'll notice that this was under appeal to pathos as well. So whether using formal, informal diction, that's part of building your ethos. You'll notice appeals to authority is also included on the building ethos, because when you use someone else's ideas and you say basically that they believe the same thing I believe, that's building your respectability. Providing your qualifications. So if you say, I'm a junior at East Campus High School, but I'm also the president of the student council and an advisor to the district advisory committee, that is saying I'm not just a standard everyday student. You should believe what I have to say more than other people. All right, so that's building ethos. All right, so basically when you're doing rhetorical analysis, you want to remember these big three questions. What, how, and why? What is the author trying to convince me of? And that kind of ties into that purpose, right? How, what kind of strategies is the author using in order to do that? How is she doing that? And why? Why is that particular strategy effective? And sometimes we talk about why is it effective to us today, but very frequently talk about why would it be effective to the original audience. If you think about Abigail Adams' letter to her son, we're reading it today. We're the present day audience, but her son was the original audience. So why would it be effective to her son, if that makes sense? What, how, and why? What is the author trying to convince me of, or what is the purpose? How is he or she achieving that purpose? What strategies are they using? Why are those strategies effective? This is something we're going to go back to over and over and over. Okay, so in class, we are going to go over this reading from Why Literature Matters from the New York Times from 2005. And we're going to talk a little bit about what kind of strategies are being used and how we would term those strategies. So I'd like you to take some time and do that as well. The other thing that we're going to be talking about today is the evidence that we got from the Google, why is Google, or is Google making us stupid article. So this is the thing that you did yesterday in class, numbered your paper 1 to 35. So I went through, and this is like the key, which we'll talk about in class. So you'll see that I've listed right here all the different types of evidence and allusions from that essay. So if you want to double check your work, I'm going to pull this up to here. I'm going to pause, if you want to pause the video right here, and you can double check the first 22 paragraphs, and then 23 through 35, pause the video and double check your paragraphs there. Any questions that you have about the types of evidence from yesterday, please let me know about. Okay, so that's basically what we're going to be covering in class today.